My name is Steve Matsumoto, and today I'll be presenting joint work with Raphael Reischuk, and I'll be presenting IKP. It's a system that aims to improve the TLS PKI by redesigning incentives through the use of smart contracts. Now, the primary goal of this work is to address certificate misissuance in TLS. If I showed you these two pages on my machine and told you to log into PayPal on one of them, which would you choose? Now, I'll tell you that one of these is safe to log into, but if you choose wrong, you'll be sending your login credentials to an attacker instead. Now, I want to point out that both of these pages look identical, and in fact, the URLs are the same. And the green lock icon indicates a trusted HTTPS page. But interestingly, the lock on the left says that the certificate is assigned to PayPal Inc., whereas on the right, the lock just says secure. And indeed, only if you were to look at the certificate hierarchy in this example, would you see that the certificate on the left or the right is signed with the EDEL root. And if you're familiar with what that is, you probably shouldn't put your login credentials into the page on the right. And this just goes to show the main problem, which is that a compromised CA can misissue a certificate for any page on the web. And if your browser happens to trust a CA, it will happily accept even the certificate on the right without indicating that anything is amiss. Now, the page on the right is a classic example of a man-in-the-middle attack. And the attacker controlling this page can intercept and modify all encrypted traffic between you and PayPal without either of you realizing. And there have been many proposals to prevent this sort of scenario from happening, but my work today is not going to focus on browser-based prevention, but rather two other related problems. So first, what can you do if you find an unauthorized certificate? Well, it turns out that even when someone finds a misissued certificate, reporting it is rarely worth it. As shown, the CA Komodo simply asks those who find a misissued certificate to send them a detailed email. Now, in fact, all CAs follow a similar process. But not only is this process tedious and time and labor intensive for the vast majority of users, why should they even bother? Even if a detector reports a misissued certificate for the greater good of TLS, they'll probably only do so for a few large sites like Google or Facebook. So we can ask, is there a way to automate this process and moreover incentivize successful reports so that people are more likely to publicize these misissued certificates? Now, to make matters worse, if someone reports an unauthorized certificate, it's often difficult to deal with the issuing CA from the browser's perspective. So each one of these dots represents a major CA failure in the recent past in which misissued certificates for sites such as Gmail, Facebook, and Microsoft were detected. Now, you probably haven't heard of most of these CAs, but because all of them were at the time trusted by most major browsers and operating systems, they could have basically done a man-in-the-middle attack on your browser at the time. Now, however, browsers can't simply remove these offending CAs because that would prevent users from accessing sites that were perfectly benign. One noteworthy example in the recent past, which you may have heard of, is Symantec, who in 2015 issued nearly 2,700 unauthorized certificates as part of an internal test that ended up leaking into the public sphere. Now, Google and Mozilla have since made the decision to remove Symantec as a trusted CA, but Symantec's response to this decision was actually quite interesting. They effectively claimed that their deep entrenchment in the CA signing business would make their removal rather disruptive. And they're right in saying that simply distrusting this CA entirely is infeasible. Now, Google and Mozilla will be phasing out Symantec over the next few years, but this highlights the difficult trade-off that exists between protecting users from potential man-in-the-middle attacks and allowing them to get to the benign sites that they want to. And it's clear that this inflexibility has led to a world in which CAs don't have the right incentives or deterrents in order to behave properly. And so therefore, we can ask, is there a way we can provide the right incentives for CAs? And in order to address these two problems, we propose Instant Karma PKI, or IKP. And our contributions in IKP are four main benefits. So the first is auditability, in that all the information that's required to determine if a CA has misbehaved or not is publicly available. Second, we provide automation, which means that once misbehavior has been successfully detected, all the responses can take place without any additional action required. We also incentivize good CAs and the exposure of CA misbehavior. And we provide deterrence. Ultimately, we want to reduce the rate of misissued certificates by guaranteeing punishments for those who misbehave. So IKP is an extension to the standard TLS infrastructure. So as in TLS, domains are going to pay CAs to receive certificates, and they can take those certificates and present them to clients during the TLS handshake. Now, we add an entity called the IKP Authority, who is responsible for the core functionality of IKP. Domains can specify what we call certificate policies, which list criteria that all of their certificates must meet, and they can register this policy at the IKP Authority. And the rationale for this design choice is that only domains truly know which certificates they have authorized and which ones they haven't. Now, the domain can also pay CAs for a form of insurance. So CAs can register at the IKP Authority to offer what we call reaction policies. And this is a form of insurance against unauthorized certificate issuance. And this is a paid service, so the domain is going to pay a fee to the CA. And in order to make sure that the IKP Authority has enough money to pay out in case of misissued certificates, the CA is going to escrow some money at the IKP Authority. Now, if we imagine as a concrete example that this domain is Google, its certificate policy may say something like, all of my certificates have to be signed by one of 2 authorized CAs. And a reaction policy may say something like, if there is an unauthorized certificate issued for Google, then they will receive $1,000 as compensation, and whoever finds such an offending certificate will get $100 as a sort of bounty. Now, I want to point out that in a common case in which nothing goes wrong, the CA can claim this escrowed money back and thus have profited from selling this reaction policy to the domain. And the IKP Authority is going to maintain all of this information locally. So we can see that if the IKP Authority publicizes this information, then all of that is publicly available. And let's say that a detector comes along, and the detector can be a CA, a domain, or a client. So it can be anybody in the IKP infrastructure. And if they find a certificate they believe to be unauthorized, they can report that to the IKP Authority. Now, we can observe that the IKP Authority now has the DCP, the RP, and the certificate. So it has all of the information that it needs in order to automatically check for misbehavior. And if it determines that this certificate is indeed unauthorized for Google, it can actually send the payouts to the appropriate parties. Now, I want to point out some features of certificate policies and reaction policies. For full details and explanations of all of these features, you should take a look at the paper. But one important thing to note is that in the certificate policy, the domain specifies a payout account. And the reason that it specifies a payout account is to provide automation. In other words, once the IKP Authority has determined that a certificate is unauthorized for this domain, rather than trying to contact the domain in order to get some means to send them the payout, it simply has that account on hand and can send it without any further action required. Now, we also use what's called a checker program and a reaction program. And what this allows us to do is to provide full flexibility by providing the core logic of both the certificate policy and the reactions via a program. And so the IKP Authority simply executes these programs in order to determine whether a certificate is authorized and what to do if the certificate is not. We also note that the certificate policy, because it controls the logic of which certificates are authorized or not, protecting the integrity of this certificate policy is extremely important. And so therefore, we allow the domain to specify a set of update keys. And so basically, we use a threshold signature to protect updates to the policy. Now, I talked about how IKP offers incentives and deterrence. But what exactly do I mean by that? Well, we've carefully adjusted the payout mechanism and the constraints on the payout specified in a reaction policy in order to provide guarantees for the parties involved. Namely, for CAs, CAs can profit from correctly issuing certificates, as we saw earlier, and this can give them a business edge over free CAs like Let's Encrypt, which is becoming increasingly used in TLS today. And our payment mechanism also guarantees that a CA cannot collude with a domain or a detector and purposely issue an unauthorized certificate in order to profit from the payouts that all the parties together would receive. We also ensure that detectors are rewarded for reporting an unauthorized certificate, and we prevent them from, for example, reporting every certificate that they come across in order to try to gain the payout for at least some of them by charging the detector a small fee to report an unauthorized certificate. And this fee is refunded if the certificate does turn out to be unauthorized. So let's take a step back and look at what IKP has achieved just with this design that we've seen. So we provide auditability in the sense that the IKP authority can maintain all this public information. And so it's very easy to see if a certificate is authorized or not, and in fact, what will happen if an unauthorized certificate is reported. We also provide automation because the IKP authority has all of the information that it needs to operate. And we also provide incentivization. Again, we've carefully adjusted our incentives to ensure that, that CAs who correctly issue certificates or those that report unauthorized certificates can profit. And we have financial penalties for misissued certificates. Now, there's a problem here, which is that the IKP authority has to be trusted. So how can we provide that functionality without trust? We can do that by instantiating IKP in Ethereum. And Ethereum provides several important properties that we leverage in this instantiation. So first, Ethereum allows autonomous accounts that maintain their own funds and data, and their behavior is controlled by code in the form of a smart contract. And so this allows us to leverage the decentralized consensus mechanism of Ethereum to ensure the correct behavior of the IKP authority. So we call this the IKP contract. It's simply a smart contract in the Ethereum blockchain. And moreover, the checker programs that are in these certificate policies can simply be placed into the block also as a smart contract. And the reaction policies, so the IKP contract, the certificate policies, and the reaction policies can all be instantiated as smart contracts that live in the Ethereum blockchain. Now, once the detector finds an unauthorized certificate, it can send, and again, this detector can be a CA, a domain, a client, or even a miner in Ethereum. It can report misbehavior by sending a certificate to the IKP contract. And that IKP contract, if it determines that there has been misbehavior, will send the payouts as transactions in the block. And so Ethereum also provides the underlying cryptocurrency that's necessary to provide these financial payouts that we saw earlier. And so thereby, this transaction will effectively give the payouts to the domain and the detector. We implemented our prototype in Solidity, which is a high-level blockchain programming language which resembles JavaScript. At the moment, our prototype only handles certificates that are hashed with SHA-256 and signed with RSA, which is still a vast majority of TLS certificates today. And in order to approximate the cost of all of our operations, we had to rely on RSA verification as a primitive in the Ethereum virtual machine. This is not an existing feature in Ethereum, but it is planned for inclusion in the near future. Now, the big takeaway from our implementation is that the cost of all of the operations in IKP are actually quite cheap. There's a one-time deployment cost of about $450. And all of the operational costs, as we can see, are actually a small fraction of certificate costs, which tend to be around several $100s USD. And an interesting thing I want to point out about this cost is that when we submitted the paper in November, actually the costs were about a tenth of this because the current Ethereum value of Ethereum, I believe, is about $150 US. And when we wrote this paper, it was about 12. So you can see that even with a large increase in cost, operating IKP is actually quite inexpensive. So for our next steps, there's still a lot of work to be done. We'd like to explore other incentive structures, and in order to do that, we could leverage principles from mechanism design and game theory to really explore what are the strongest incentives that we can offer through the use of IKP, and we'd like to explore more sophisticated certificate policies and reaction policies. In particular, we'd like to be able to interface with external data using a system such as town crier. So for example, we could have in a certificate policy a requirement that a certificate be logged in, for example, a certificate transparency log, and policies could account for fluctuations in ether price to provide a more real-world guarantee of how much a domain or detector will receive. So in conclusion, with our instantiation in Ethereum, we've provided auditability in the form of public policies on the Ethereum blockchain. We've provided automation by implementing all of the main logic of IKP as smart contracts. We've carefully designed our incentives to realign behavior with what should happen in TLS, and we provide deterrence through the use of public financial penalties. And so in IKP, we've taken a strong step towards better incentives and more reasonable deterrence in the TLS PKI. Thank you very much.
Ben Fuller, UConn. Why do you need the CA involved in the RP? Why couldn't the domain just issue an RP directly to the IKP?
So if the domain, so the RP is a form of insurance. There isn't really such a thing as self-insurance. It doesn't make sense if the domain is escrowing the funds that's going to be required to compensate it in case something bad happens. That doesn't really make a lot of sense economically. And the CAs can do it because they essentially can provide a value-added service through basically providing insurance against misbehavior.
Right, but they have an incentive, the CAs, to make this payment as small as possible, while the domains have an incentive to make it actually large enough to get somebody to report it.
So the terms of the policy are negotiated between the domain and the CA. It's not just that the CA says, I'm going to give you insurance, you're going to pay me this much. I mean, that all is negotiated in the policy as current insurance is.
Thank you.
Hi, Alin Tomescu, MIT. Thanks for the talk, really great. I think it's really important that we figure out what to do when we detect impersonation. I was hoping, I didn't really understand how we can prove impersonation though. Like, if my policy as google.com is only Symantec can issue certs for me, and then I see a fake cert from Symantec, how can I convince anyone that that is a fake cert?
Right, so determining whether a certificate is unauthorized or not is the domain's responsibility. If the domain were to say that all of my certificates have to be issued by these two CAs, as we saw in our example, then of course we can't prevent a situation in which those trusted CAs issue bad certificates. However, the flexibility offered by the checker programs, by the certificate policies, allow us to actually capture a variety of existing solutions that we've seen. So for example, the domain could say, all the certificates have to have one of the following public keys, and we can essentially implement a form of public key pinning. And the paper has lots of different examples of policies that we can that they can implement in these certificate policies, and it's essentially limited by the Ethereum programming languages.
Thanks.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on that notion. I don't think there is a clear definition of what a legitimate certificate is. Companies are very large. They may actually have different parts requesting different certs from different places. So I would think that this might edge onto posing as some sort of regulation and restraint of trade objections. And it seems like a complicated legal area.
So I would guess that for the vast majority of large domains, their policies wouldn't be just one person writing what their certificate policy should look like. And there's bound to be, especially in large companies, a lot of legal hurdles to get over just to have this policy in place. Now, ultimately, that is the best we can do in terms of determining whether a certificate is authorized or not, is what the domain says it is. There may be other legal issues. We don't cover that in the paper, except to say that the legal framework can be a sort of fallback for if IKP fails, for example, by a domain not specifying its policy properly.
Do you think that the government should come in and regulate what a legitimate cert is?
I think that that would probably add a lot of complication, and there's a lot of misgivings about the role of such a role of government in terms of trying to regulate what a certificate can be. The CA Browser Forum does a fairly good job of that today.
Is yours a really quick question?
Just two things real quick. First, I wanted to really applaud the technical merits of the work here. I'm very grateful for the contribution. Also, full disclosure, I'm from Semantic, and in the spirit of a joke to hopefully make you laugh more, I think it was Mark Twain that once said, the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. So just for precision, where you were saying that Google, very well-respected member of the community, will do certain things, they had proposed doing certain things, and we've been working with them night and day on a better proposal.
Yes.
So,
Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve.